A Virginia House of Delegates Democratic candidate live-streamed sex acts with her husband in exchange for money, according to the Washington Post. Susanna Gibson, running for a key seat in a high-stakes race, allegedly performed sexual acts that were published live on a platform called Chatterbait.
The outlet was alerted by a Republican operative. In a statement to the Post, Gibson appears to take umbrage with Republicans, writing in the expose, quote, "An illegal invasion of my privacy designed to humiliate me and my family. It won't intimidate me and it won't silence me. My political opponents and their Republican allies have proven they're willing to commit a sex crime to attack me and my family because there's no line they won't cross." Though the videos are no longer available, over a dozen were archived and have been uploaded to other sites. It is unclear when the videos were taken, but 2 were archived September 30th, 2022, after she kicked off her bid for the Richmond District House seat. I think this is one of those situations where, this shows she understands economic struggle in America. And it doesn't even matter if she wasn't doing this because she needed the money. I think people's personal lives includes their sex lives and should remain private. I don't think someone should be judged for this. I think someone who runs for public office should be more judged if they had a career working for a corporate law firm, or if they had a career working in Goldman Sachs or with the fossil fuel industry. There are a ton of members of Congress who have ties to all kinds of industries that would pretty much ruin their ability to make good judgment on policy when it comes to those industries, and they would likely have a bias towards their friends and allies or whoever they have stock money invested in, and then they're responsible for regulating that company. I care way more about that. It has real policy consequences than what someone does in their personal lives.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see what the voters in this very competitive district, I believe it's rated as R+1, in what is a very critical election here in the Commonwealth, where, Governor Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, is working to shore up his support in both the House of Delegates and the state Senate. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays into this. I do think it's interesting, sort of putting aside the question of whether or not this is anything to be ashamed of or not. Does she have the right to claim that this is revenge porn when this was something that she was producing and putting out and selling live on the internet? It kind of reminds me some parallels to Hunter Biden and his laptop, where he's claiming that, this information should never have been made public because this is mine. But again, he's the one that left it abandoned at a laptop repair shop for weeks and weeks on end. So when you're producing this and making this, and it's not surreptitiously recorded, and arguably you consented to recording yourself and publishing it or streaming it live on the internet, what sort of legal questions does that open up about how, whether she's able to claim that just noting that she did this herself, how is that trying to silence her?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how this sort of world of streaming and the OnlyFans and the sort of worker-controlled sex work is changing how people view the issue. I think we would have seen a lot more of this group of people that are upset about OnlyFans and online streaming and these kinds of sex work that's facilitated through the internet. Those same people that are very outraged about this were not upset about porn in the same way, traditional porn, where, a worker shows up and does what they have to do and they get paid by the people who post it. They're not posting it themselves. Why were you not upset there? And I think it has something to do with, in this world of OnlyFans, in this world of streaming where you post the video yourself, you own the means of production, you're in control. And I think it was probably much more comfortable to a lot of men, I think specifically, when women were doing sex work in a way that it was controlled by men. And so now there's this whole new dynamic. And I think because this was something that was streamed and it's not like she has a history of being an actress in porn, it's a bit of a different scenario and maybe it's being handled differently. Is it revenge porn is an interesting question, because it was my understanding that revenge porn is when there's a sex act that is recorded entirely in private and it is then made public. But maybe you could claim some kind of breach of a financial contract when you agree to purchase viewership of the video and only view it and not share it and reproduce it. You don't have the rights to the video. Perhaps it's a copyright claim rather than revenge porn. I'm not sure how this is going to be handled here, but it does feel wrong. And so seeing how this plays out in the court of law Will it go in the direction of justice? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting if you read the Washington Post's original story on this. It's a bit of a long read, actually, because it dives into a lot of sort of the ins and outs of how this platform worked and this idea of tokens being purchased with real dollars that are then used in the platform and can be cashed out by whomever you give the tokens to, and how this candidate was urging people to give more tokens in order to get private, for lack of a better term, private seats to watch her and her husband do these things. It was interesting that the Washington Post noted that they do have a policy to not name victims in these sort of situations, but they made an exception based on a few criteria that they felt this story met, which again was that the videos were published by the person, the subject specifically, and that they were available on a website that didn't require a password. And so I think you're right that this is, again, sort of uncharted territory for whether or not it rises to the level of a scandal for this sort of a situation, because again, we just don't have that many cases and that much precedent yet for how to handle these kind of things. And it might, like you said, ultimately come down to just the terms of service on Chatterbait and what sort of things they allow and whether the person broadcasting or performing actually owns the right to that, if Chatterbait owns that once it goes out on their system. There's just a lot of gray area here that I think will be interesting, but I do worry that this will obviously take up a lot of oxygen for her campaign and limit the ability for her to try to actually get out and campaign on the issues. I feel like she's going to be talking about this a lot more.
I think that's a really good point. I think most people feel some type of way about someone who's done sex work in their past. We still, I think, have grown up in a culture that's influenced by Protestant values in many ways, even if most people, if you're not religious, I think the society we live in still views this as very taboo. There's definitely not a homogenous view of sex work, even within the Democratic Party or the progressive faction of the Democratic Party. And so it's a tough situation to judge how this is going to affect her campaign. I think you're right that she might spend most of her time talking about that issue, and it might push the conversation forward. But when we think about strategically, is this seat going to go to her or a Republican? That puts us in a tough situation, because are we willing to stop her campaign entirely because of what she has done in her past and because she has done sex work? I think that puts the party in a really interesting position if they want to start pushing another candidate or not. And so we have to think about this strategically, but we also have to think about the grand scheme of things. Is this a norm that we really value changing so much that we're going to defend her and her campaign? I think a lot of people are going to have to make up their mind about this issue if this does take up a lot of airspace and becomes a major, thing that people are talking about this time around.
And it's definitely interesting, too, when you think back to other candidates or politicians, people who have had higher offices or been seeking higher offices than a House of Delegates seat here in Virginia. You think of, Anthony Weiner. You think of Bill Clinton. You think of people who had, very salacious scandals. I think, Anthony Weiner's was a little bit more public, but it's just interesting to see how, as a country and as an electorate, we view these things and judge the different players in them. And I think this will kind of be added to that list, even if on a smaller scale, in terms of how voters view these things and what they're willing to accept or not accept. But we will obviously keep you updated on that as we head towards November. There will be more rising right after this.